Okay, well, I am really happy to be here with Raffaello Manacorda. Rafa is someone that I've been really curious to have a particular conversation with for a while. I've had an inner hit for a while, Rafa, that I want to talk to Rafa about this stuff. I want to have an interview with Rafa. So Rafa is an international facilitator with ISTA, and you also run your own retreats and containers and explorations. Rafa is someone who has done deep work over many, many years in the domain of human embodiment, conscious sexuality, transformation, parts work, integrated transformation, and also something that I find really well, the reason that I was really curious to have this conversation with you, Rafa, is because your being and your work has this very strong overlap between a really deep level of work that you've done around all the different parts of what it means to be a human being and what it means to have a really honest embrace and integration of all of that. Plus, you have this really strong orientation towards the political social domain and you have a history there and so your work kind of and your perspective and your being kind of straddles these two domains in a way that I find you have a really interesting stream of perspective and reflection. And so the particular topic that I was super curious for us to dive in around is to do with the the sense I've had that underneath so much of the political polarization and charge that's alive today, there's a conversation about masculinity and what masculinity really means. And it's a conversation that absolutely includes femininity and what femininity really means as well. But there's a whole dynamic which is deeply charged in the collective conversation, but it's not really being spoken about. It's under the surface about our relationship to these things that I felt I'd be super curious to have a conversation with you about. So also if there's any other way that you want to introduce yourself or any other pieces you want to add, um, also passing over to you.
Thank you. That was a great intro, John. Thank you so much. And likewise, I'm also very, very excited to talk to you, to have a conversation with you, because I feel that our souls are in resonance on many aspects, even though we may express our purpose and work in the world in different ways, but also very aligned with each other. So it's beautiful. Your introduction is perfectly accurate. I would say, if I had to somehow give myself a title, an archetypal title, I often fall back to that of being a practical philosopher. It's also what I am
Mm.
by, let's say, academic title, but meaning really like in the deep meaning of that, like I love to understand with my whole body, with my whole being, not just intellectually what happens here, what happens in this manifestation. And because of that impulse, as you were saying so beautifully, I almost cannot, shield myself away from the political dimension. I cannot escape the sexual, human, emotional dimension. I cannot escape the psychological angle to whatever happens on this planet. So, yes, you're right. It's a lot of straddling, and sometimes my soul and my intellect can ache because of the straddling and because of the stretching, but it's also really my way. And I feel perhaps there we have also a point of contact in really wanting to bridge these dimensions. And perhaps, let's see where this conversation takes us. But I'm just sensing that perhaps part of the problem that we are somehow looking at, and you'll define it, I'm sure, much better than I could do. Part of the problem is also in the segmentation and in the way that, let's say, politics, for example, or the dealings of power, if we want to be even more archetypal in the language, has been severed from emotions, has been severed from psychology, as if we could manage all these different, domains independently. But I have a sense that that's part of what's not working, in a way. So I'm super happy to have this like multi-channeled conversation, omnicomprehensive conversation, and I'm here. I'm here for it. So lead us on, and I'll follow and share whatever I can. And I'm super excited to have this completely unrehearsed and fresh conversation with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rafa. Yeah, I really appreciate you. I love the practical philosopher piece. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so maybe a place to start. As I have watched the global phenomenon that is Donald Trump over the last few years, and I have, first of all, just been amazed that an individual can have such an insanely vast impact on the global process. Just that is quite extraordinary. But as I have watched this global phenomenon that is Donald Trump, in terms of his decision making, in terms of the way that he shows up in the world, his reactions to things, an impression that I've got is that this man has a very clear sense of the masculine and what the masculine is. This man to me seems like, and of course I don't know. I haven't been in a room with Donald Trump. I haven't had conversations with Donald Trump. I've never asked him these questions. But for instance, as I've witnessed Donald Trump's, and I'm using Donald Trump as a springboard here into a wider conversation, but as I've witnessed Donald Trump's disdain for European leaders, and as I've witnessed Donald Trump's affinity with strongman leaders like Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong Un, others around the world who have been leading more right wing populist movements, despite the fact that many people in the modern West have been horrified by that and have found it so utterly confusing. Like, oh my God, what's going on? This guy is suddenly wanting to make friends with the people, the leaders that formerly were deemed to be the most undesirable, the most, pariahs as far as us actually making contact with these people are concerned. And I've asked myself the question, why? Like, why does he seem to have this particular affinity with these types of leaders? Why does he seem to have this disdain for, European leaders and so on? My intuition, and I'm sure it's more multifaceted than this, but my intuition is there's something here to do with his sense of the masculine. And I think my intuition is he sees in a Vladimir Putin, or he sees in some of these other more authoritarian leaders an example of what a man is. And obviously we're differentiating the masculine from man, and male. These are all important distinctions to make, to have a discerning conversation about this. But if I put myself in what I imagine Trump's perspective is, I think he sees a vision of a man in these other leaders which resonates for him and which speaks to his sense of, yes, that's what a man should be. Whereas I think part of his disdain for the European leaders is this is not what a man should be. These liberal men who have these overly inclusive tendencies, and all sorts of other things we could say. And the springboard here is, my sense is that I think his popularity is because those perspectives are quite widely held. I think there's a lot of people who want this more strongman image to be represented in the world, even if it comes with actions that we find deeply unethical or problematic. And I think there's a deep tension there around ethics, inclusivity, the image of and what masculinity is, the fact that it seems like Republicans and Democrats, or those who are more conservative and liberal, actually have very different images of what a healthy masculine energy is. There's all sorts of directions we could go off from there, and I'm sure we will. But just starting there, the idea that underneath the conversations about policies and politics and so on, a conversation that isn't happening consciously but is going on is, what is the masculine, and how do we want to relate to the masculine today, and all the emotional energies associated with that, frustrations, longings, kind of explosive energies, anger about repression or desired expression and so on. And how does this land for you, Rafa?
It lands really well. I would say let's follow your intuition. I think it's a really good intuition. And in my language, what I would say, just as a premise before we dive deep, is what you are offering and proposing in your own words is to look at almost transcendental decisions that are being made on the world stage by who is the leader of one of the two big superpowers in our day and age, but to look at them through the lens of psychology, through the lens of emotion, through the lens of collective unconscious and therefore archetypes. And I think that is just very wise. Like the idea that leaders or politicians are some kind of disembodied rational actor that, acts based on their ideologies or the campaign promises they made, and that emotions, archetypes, their own shadow patterns have no play in that. This idea is flawed. It is not like that. It is not like that for economic actors. It is not like that for uh, political actors. And so we need to go there. We need to think about what's going on in Trump's head. And that's one angle. And the opposite and complementary angle is how is Donald Trump, in this case, an expression of collective pulsions, psychic pulsions, collective anxieties, collective desires, collective instincts that are just being channeled and finding an expression through this specific human being with all of his personality and different psychological makeup. And I think you're a really good track there. So if we accept that as a possible frame, I would absolutely agree with you that there is something about, let's use Trump as a trampoline, as you said. There's something about this man that uh, deeply responds to contents in the collective unconscious that need and want and press to be expressed. And these contents, if we want to put labels on them that are not, completely accurate, but as guidelines, these contents have to do with the masculine. Yes, I agree with that. And I would even qualify it a step further, and maybe we can elaborate more on this, but the framework that I use, and I know that you are familiar with it, is that specifically these are contents related to the aspect of the masculine that is more earthy, gross, thick. In perhaps more psychological or esoteric vocabulary, we could say the dark masculine. And obviously, already just saying that, can bring a lot of reactions in us, in the people that are listening to us. And it's important to really keep clarity here by saying, look, archetypal contents, and we can define this better, can be extremely damaging, extremely empowering, healthy and unhealthy, in service of life and in denial of life. They're, in essence, they're quite neutral to our destiny and to our preferences, but they exist. And one of the ways that we can explain the charisma that someone like Donald Trump undoubtedly can wield towards large numbers of humans is because they are being the mouthpiece of some archetypal content that wants to be expressed. And if we accept that premise, then we can investigate together. Like, what is it? Why is it that it's got such a pressure to be expressed? And is anyone else aware of it? And is anyone else, giving it a try to express the same content? And there's a lot of interesting conversations that can be given, that can be approached with this premise as a valid premise. So yes, I agree with that.
Beautiful. Thank you. So let's start there. Yeah. So and fleshing that out as well a bit more for anyone who's not familiar with that model. One model that you and I, as you said, are familiar with is understanding first of all that masculine and feminine, what we call them, energies, forces, are archetypal forces that can play through human beings, whether of male or female bodies who identify as men or women and so on, that there's a differentiation between all these things. And that also sometimes we talk about the light masculine and the dark masculine, the light feminine and the dark feminine. When we talk about the light form of these, we're talking about a form that plays out more through the kind of the heart layers and the consciousness layers of a being, through the intellectual layers, the more broadly big vision, wider embrace layers of the masculine or the feminine. And when we talk about the dark masculine and the dark feminine, we're talking about more embodied, more earthy, particularly in terms of the dark masculine, more kind of penetrative, more direct, more yeah, like more battle ready, as it were, you know. And a really important distinction here, which is one that is part of the whole thing that we're talking about, is that a lot of people don't have a clear distinction between the shadow masculine and the dark masculine, right? So
Correct.
generally, our examples and exemplars of expressions of masculine energy that have come through this more earthy, battle ready, penetrative nature have been incredibly shadowy. And when we're talking about the dark masculine, we're actually talking about a healthy expression of healthy masculine energy that can move through the more embodied aspects of the human being and the human experience, right? That said, we don't have a good distinction between these two things, between the more shadowy expressions, which are more driven by ego, personal needs and agendas, destructive violent impulses for the sake of it, and so on, and expressions of healthy masculine energy that come through an embodied, animal integrated, heart connected being. And that gets really, really confusing. And one symptom of that is, I'm not sure, I'm curious about your tracking of this over the last years, the whole conversation around toxic masculinity, right? Where there's started to be more and more of a conversation about, hey, I think toxic masculinity is a thing. I think that actually there are expressions of masculine energy that are toxic, that have painful, trauma perpetuating, destructive, like unhealthily or kind of erosive and destructive expressions in the world. And yet there's a lot of people, particularly actually I notice on the kind of more conservative right-wing Republican side, who completely reject the idea that that's even a worthwhile conversation to have, because the way they interpret it is the idea that we're saying that masculinity itself is toxic, which is that no, that's not what's being said here. That masculinity is an archetypal energy that can express in healthy or unhealthy forms, as well as light and dark forms and shadowy forms and so on. So it feels like there's nuances around how to talk about these things, which are just in the beginning of, like, even pre the beginning of their entry into a mainstream conversation. I remember that doing work around light and dark, masculine and feminine some years ago in some of my other work, I did a Google search for, this was maybe 6 years ago, for the dark feminine. Just Google search dark feminine. And there was a bunch of stuff that came up, around, Kali integration and, like own your inner witch and da 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 da, right? But I then did a Google search for dark masculine and there was nothing apart from stuff that was to do with, yeah, perpetratory, just really shadowy expressions of men in various contexts. So I'm sure this is something which you experience in the work that you do, that this is we are learning to be able to have this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been, around these issues so many times in my own journey and working with groups. And it's an extremely complex situation because, first of all, and without going too much in detail, like we cannot ignore that we live mostly in cultures that are skewed one way or another. It's kind of a feature of human collective creation. So to really simplify things, even if we don't make, a big discourse around patriarchy, but it is undeniable that just on an archetypal level, and religion is a good guide for that, but just also the organization of society somehow has made it so that the masculine values and frameworks are dominant in certain areas, not everywhere, but in certain areas, and specifically in the areas of the managing of power and the managing of money. Okay, that's step number one. Then step number two is that when that happens, inevitably because of the principles of psychic wholeness, there will need to be a combination of light and dark qualities being expressed. And this is something that if we take it away from like, big geopolitics and put it just, for example, in a smaller container of parenting, right? Like no one, I don't think anyone would argue anymore that a parent, let's say a father, needs to be both very compassionate and at times very stern. There's going to be some situations in which most people will agree with that. No one would argue that you just need to be sweet to your child. It's all you need to do, and then everything will be okay. It's like, no, that's not gonna fly. The opposite, of course, also not true. If you're just a stern parent and incapable of empathy and heart melting into your child, it's gonna create a lot of issues and a lot of problems. So wholeness is what we're aiming and what parents are heroically aiming to, given the fact that each one of us is skewed and has lots of, fractures, etc. But the same is true for any environment. The same is true in politics. The same is true in business. What's the problem then? The problem is that when we take this outside of the private sphere of the individual and we put it into contexts that have much more of a global impact, like global politics, our level of dysmorphia, our level of distortion of what a human being could or should be is amplified by thousands of times. So on one level, and so we as humanity get to have this really schizophrenic, dysfunctional, bipolar, I'm not using exact labels here, but relationship with our leaders, where on one level, part of our collective psyche would want our political leaders, and I'm gonna focus mostly on men. We could flip the conversation. A part of us still would want them to be always patient, always kind, asexual, essentially. Like we don't it doesn't add any value to theoretically to our model of political governance to know about a political leader's sexual life. We prefer them to be asexual, which is of course impossible, unless that's their choice. And so on one level we want to create this image of light masculine only, right? And some political leaders dedicate their entire life to matching that. On the other level, though, in the undercurrent of psychology, another part of our individual and collective psyche gets absolutely magnetized by the opposite, by the presence of the dark masculine in a political leader. And you were referring before, the dark, what are some qualities of the dark masculine? Well, the directness and the being battle ready, and that's totally true. Another one that has been one of Trump's most incredible winning cards is instinctuality. While we can say, on a more conscious up here level that we want our political leaders to be reflexive, that they reflect, that they consider all of the different opinions, but then another part of our psyche is deeply magnetized by a politician in power that doesn't think too much,
Just
doesn't
reacting.
appear, yeah, that just like tweets at 3 a.m., and uses
Yeah.
all caps and says basically stops very, very this short of saying fuck you to another political leader over Twitter. And so our conscious mind can judge it, but the part of our psyche that knows that a leader needs both goes like, oh, yeah, I mean, I trust that more than I would trust an angelical chief of government that is supposed to be completely clear and clean and without any darkness. So it's a deeply dysfunctional relationship that we have with our political leaders. And of course, if someone like Trump can navigate that and can, just respond to that longing, they're going to have, in the short term, an incredible grip on collective psyche. Then, and I'm just gonna bookmark that. Maybe we can talk about it later. But in my observation, anyway, in the longer term, there are there are deep risks as well. And this is not to criticize or not criticize. It's just that the masses falling in love with a certain archetype that's missing from collective consciousness in that moment after a few years or decades, usually ends up in a very drastic and painful way in the moment of the projection being broken. So in the moment of the masses, the political mass of voters realizing that actually that individual carried also all the wounds and shadow, and they were not an archetype like anyone, nobody can be. So all of this to say, yes, definitely Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump, just like you and I, also doesn't know the difference between healthy and unhealthy dark masculine. Because of his upbringing and because of his whatever temperament, he can embody certain qualities of that archetypal spectrum. Those qualities have been sorely missing from the political conversation, and I would argue, especially from the political conversation in the right side of the spectrum, if we go just back a couple of generations. And so he's, in this sense, he's the right person at the right time to give voice to the innate, unspeakable longing of humanity for psychic wholeness. And I say unspeakable because while that longing is there, you cannot fully articulate it because that would not be accepted by anybody really. It's too scary to verbalize it fully.
So much there, Rafa. There's so much there. First of all, I want to reflect like this piece that you just ended with. Donald Trump is an expression of our collective instinctual need for psychic wholeness. Just that is such a powerful thing to be with, without making Donald Trump himself an example of embodied psychic wholeness, right? It's the collective attempted self-rightening, essentially, of a force rising and essentially saying, "Hey, you forgot me. You left me out." And actually, I'm coming with an expression of this that's all sorts of shades of, shadowy and in some cases healthy, and all sorts of stuff in between, But you forgot this voice. That was actually something which I'm reminded was present for me when Brexit happened. Where, sorry, I'm British, and I went to bed the night before the Brexit vote, certain that there was no way this was going to happen. It felt like the vote felt like a formality. They said they were going to have a referendum for decades. They're doing it. We all know how this is going to go. And waking up the next morning and seeing the result and just being like, oh my God, what is this? And just being blown away. And it took me, I think, 2 days to have it really land in me, what a sense of, wait, what just happened? And what I started to get was, oh, there, of course, yes, there's a whole bunch of people who have issues with the bureaucracy of the European Union and so on, have intellectual reasons for their choice and so on. But there was also a huge swath of people who were pissed, and who felt like actually we've been fundamentally left behind by the neoliberal economic machine for generations, and this is our chance to say no, you know. And I think that's how I look at MAGA. That's how I look at the massive swath of people who are Trumpers to the death, right, to the end, because they feel so fundamentally left behind by the liberal establishment power thing that had become the seat of power in the world, both in the States, in Europe, internationally as well, that claimed to have all of these kind of Western enlightened answers for everybody's problems, and at the same time had fundamentally failed to bring the solutions which it implicitly promised. And those people are pissed. And not only that, but they also are calling out bullshit on these kinds of more light masculine expressions of power that actually we all know and regularly reveal themselves to carry just as much corruption as you know as we're used to in other contexts. However, despite the fact that they're singing a song of nobility and and morality and so on, and that irks us even more. It hurts more when a figure who is meant to be, or who is claiming to be, a voice of purity and integrity is found to be corrupt. We feel even more betrayed, even more let down. So just starting there, but I mean, there's a piece here around something I've tracked with Donald Trump is, he is brazen. And his brazenness, sometimes I feel like, is it brazenness? Is it authenticity? He reacts when you look at that man, I think you're probably seeing how he really thinks and feels about things. You know, that's it. I'm not sure there's much of a filter, right? And something I feel like people who have been exposed to this more, I would say, shadowy light masculine version of what leaders and wielders of power and politicians have been trying to be and playing the game to be for decades because of some collective consensus and trance that that's what we want, as you said, of our leaders. We know it's bullshit. We know it's not really real. We know that there's an act that's happening and a game being played, and we're all frustrated, and the answers aren't coming despite the endless, and everyone, there is so much rage about seeing another politician again being interviewed and asked these questions that are clear questions and not answering the question and not answering the question and not answering the question, and exemplifying this nobility, or and it's so shadowy. And then you get Trump, and Trump is unfiltered. He is reactive. He's tweeting at 3 a.m., stopping short, as you said, of just saying "fuck you" to endless people. And I think something I track is just on an emotional, energetic level. There's something in the collective which is like, thank God, thank God. Not, I mean, and obviously, and the other side of it is horror. People just being horrified, like, oh my God, that's the guy who's the leader of the free world, But it's this polarity between, oh my God, thank God that someone's just fucking being real, finally. And on the other side, terror and horror that actually a man who's demonstrating in his realness, in his brazenness or authenticity, misogyny, open racism, xenophobia, all of these things, is actually the leader of the free world. And we don't know what to do. In the middle, we're just like, oh my God, what did we do about this? And so it's this piece that you mentioned about this is an expression of energies which have been repressed. And I think there's a really interesting thing there as well that I'm curious about your perspective on, which is I think there's a lot of male rage that is part of this. And I think that's in the kind of in the male, female, masculine, feminine domain, there's a whole amount of repressed rage that has a correspondence in the race domain as well, where one of the reasons that I think Trump is very popular is a lot of people just can't stand feeling like they're supposed to hold white guilt that they don't really understand anymore, and hold this weight of the collective history of white culture in all of its perpetuation of trauma and legacies of disempowerment and systemic oppression and so on. And there's a lot of people who are like, I don't want to hold that anymore. Liberal culture has said white culture has to hold that because this is the truth of our history. And there's a lot of people that are like, no, I don't want to hold that. They maybe don't even understand it, don't understand the systemic historical realities and don't want to understand. And then there's also that version of that as far as men are concerned, and the domain of the masculine, where there's certain aspects of what male energy or masculine energy is, which are obvious, they are responsible for huge amounts of pain and trauma and horrendous, terrible things which have been going on in our world for thousands and thousands of years. And the attempt to address that within liberal culture that has come with this attempted self-reflection about the shadows of it. I think there's a lot of people who are like, I don't want to deal with that. There's an energetic uprush that wants to happen in response to a sensed repression. And so I'm curious how you track some of those pieces.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to really underline, like, I'll get exactly to your last question, but something that I want to underline from what you shared so beautifully is that because we are all very used to understanding quickly enough what's the abusive version of, let's say, the dark masculine. It's like it's rape, pillage, invasion of boundaries. But what's the abusive version of the light? That's not so easy
Mhm.
to track. for a number of reasons that I won't go into right now. But essentially, the abusive version of the light masculine, for example, is pretty much what you were referring to and what you were calling bullshit on. It's the patronizing, it's the virtue signaling, it's the being on a high moral ground. And then, of course, sooner or later, dada, you're just as fucked up as everyone else, but that stings so much more because you've been on a high moral horse. So now when your affair gets discovered, I remember, when the Clinton affair happened and Monica Lewinsky was so outrageous also because of the image that this particular leader had projected. When Donald Trump's affairs were sort of like put in the light, it was like, yeah, whatever. Clearly, he says pretty much openly that he likes to do this and that. So all of this to say that virtue signaling, the being on a high moral ground, the insisting on purity after a certain threshold is actually outright abusive to the psyche of people. And it generates eventually in time rage, as you correctly identified. So that's a problem. And that's a problem that in the short term may result in us feeling someone like Donald Trump like a breath of fresh air. In the long run, in my feeling, it will not work anyway because the premise is flawed. And the premise is that any political leader, for instance, should embody superhuman qualities of integrity, of immediacy, of strength, of courage. And no, nobody can because they're still human and they're still fucked up. So it would require a complete refoundation of our moral system to get out of this loop, where we get frustrated and call bullshit on one side of the archetypal world and then wait for someone else to embody the other side, and then the same happens. And the same will happen as well, in my feeling with Donald Trump. So that's kind of the context that I see this happening in. And then if we now, get to talk about some of the symptoms of this problem, yeah, I agree with you. Like people like, the male population in certain parts of the US, for example, certain parts of the white population, clearly were obvious candidates to say, hey, I don't want anymore to take on the guilt or the shame of what's happened in the last 2000 years. That's clear. And also, as it's been shown by the last, for example, presidential elections in the US, but also many other less consequential elections around the world, it goes beyond that. It goes way beyond that. You get women voting for Trump, you get Hispanic population largely voting for Trump, you get a significant sector of the black population. Why is that? Because it speaks to something deeper. It speaks to the fact that if now the white man can be moralized to death, and can be essentially made to go out in public and say, I am the problem, then, well, it will come to me as well, because deep down, I know whether I'm black or white or Hispanic or female or male, deep in the chamber of my heart, I know that I also have tendencies that are, both light and dark, both healthy and unhealthy. So it's very scary to be in the hands of a moralizer. It's very scary. It can be reassuring at first, but then it becomes scary after a while. And vice versa, being in the hands of an impulsive strongman can feel very safe for a while, and then it becomes terribly scary. And it's like really a loop, of going from healthy to unhealthy, this side, from healthy to unhealthy, that side, and pendulating because we are not ready as humanity yet to tackle the root of it. And the root of it is an ethical, moral system that is predicated on people having split personalities, on people being able to have no shadow and only healthy traits, and that's psychologically an oxymoron, an impossibility, a contradiction in terms. So it won't work. It will never work. So now we are in, if I look at that in the cycle of things, now definitely I would say a large part of humanity is coming out of an incredibly strong moralizing impulse, directed towards masculinity that had some incredibly good consequences, but also inevitable fatigue and psychic hurt. And a large segment of the population doesn't want that anymore, doesn't want to be preached at anymore, doesn't want to be told that you always should be reflective and considerate. Like, fuck no, as a human, I'm not always like that. And if there is a leader that can give me a break from that, then many people will decide to vote for him.
Brilliant, brilliant, Rafa. Yeah, there's a bunch of places I want to explore what you just shared. One of the things that comes up for me as I hear you is that I do feel like Donald Trump is this living permission slip, for the selfish, materially pragmatic expression of my desires, what I want. I don't care what you want. I'm going to get mine, and this is how I judge you, and I'm just going to be straight about it. And just all of these. I do feel there's a particular piece about desire as well, like erotic desire as well. Like materialistic desire, erotic desire, personal desire. Trump just owns it. And there's obviously part of the shadow of the light masculine is the repression of that, and the moralizing of that, and all the reasons why it's a good idea, for that to be repressed. Let's talk about the history. We know the dangers and da 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 da, and the patterns of trauma, and so this is what we need to be, this more upstanding version, and these are the safe contexts in which we need to sequester male, masculine desire, and da da. And of course, within that kind of pressure cooker, there's then going to be this breath of relief when there's someone who shows up who is just brazen in their materialistic, personal, selfish, erotic desires. Just the fact that he got this he just got a pass before he was, I think it was the first time that he was coming into his presidency. And there was this clip that was released of him walking along in this bus and next to this bus, and him saying all of this stuff about the way that he treats women in kind of sexual context, which was so utterly the kind of thing that any other politician playing the normal game would be, that's career ending, done. We're not, no more conversation. And he just gets a pass, and from women. There's like the number of women who I saw interviewed after that, and they're like, well, it's locker room talk. Boys will be boys, right? And all of this type of stuff. And so, yeah, just what that represents in the collective psyche is such a fascinating thing about our own relationship to desire, our own relationship to eros, our own relationship to owning what we want. And yeah, so that's just a piece. Where else did I want to go from there? Yeah, the other piece which you mentioned is, which is big, is you were speaking about a needed reframe, essentially for our whole relationship to leadership. If we acknowledge what you just said, which is that the premise of the whole conversation is flawed, the premise of the whole way that we're viewing all of this is, it begins with a schism in our own collective psyche where we need it to be this or that, and neither has an answer because both are partial and contain all sorts of shadows that we don't even collectively know how to talk about yet. But that's what we need for us to feel safe around, because we carry a story, that's what we need to feel safe around those who are entrusted to be in positions of leadership. Then what is that reframe that needs to happen? Like, what is the dramatic shift in our relationship to leadership that needs to happen? Because obviously it must be our best healthy integration of both in a way that also has space for shadow, because shadow is human, right? So I'm curious to hear you speak into that. Like, what would you feel if we could, if there are spaces? I would hope singularity would be one of these spaces where we can experiment with this type of culture change around our relationship to leadership. What, in your view, would be that, if we go ambitious here in a way that stays with space for shadow and regular human failings, what would be the reframe that you think would be the most healthy reorientation around leadership?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. So in the big picture, it would be essentially bit by bit refounding our ethic and morals in an I can just say in an embodied way, in a
Mm,
way that is not Cartesian and disembodied.
mm,
So up until today, our ethical and moral systems are based on logical ideas of what a human being should be. They don't very much take into account the embodied reality of what it is to be human.
yeah.
And that means having desires, having instincts, having shadow. So refounding ethics and morals on a different idea of psychic and human wholeness is what is needed. And some people have attempted that in the past. Most notably, some students of Jung's have tried to do that, but clearly humanity wasn't ready. That's the big picture. On a more approachable level, and I love that you're asking this also as someone that is involved in spearheading or founding a political movement, a political voice in the political arena. And so I think these questions are very real for you. It's not just theoretical, speculation. And I think there are some things that are within reach. For instance, vulnerability. Just even that,
Mm,
just even putting it into some kind of code of conduct for a leader of an organization, that vulnerability is a good thing, it's a value, it's not a problem, it's not like some kind of bug, that this person,
weakness. It's not
or a
weakness.
weakness, exactly. It's not a bug that this person will show up once in a meeting and say, I feel really tender today about what I'm going to share. Like, if leaders are willing and courageous to demonstrate that, that's already a really good step forward. Obviously, this is the easy-ish low-hanging fruit. There are others that are more difficult, like the fact that every leader in any organization, with very few exceptions, is going to be a sexual being. And this parental distortion that happens between leaders and leadees that want to maintain the illusion of the leader as a parental figure being asexual needs to be addressed. I mean, that's just not true. We're adults here, adults there, so the person that's leading you is a sexual being. You can't forever cover your eyes in front of that, and they cannot forever hide that basic fact of nature. So that would, in my opinion, um, sort of like dissolve, or at least transform, the whole piece and usage of sexuality as a political scandal weapon. Like, literally today, you don't need to have, as a leader, you don't need to have abused anybody to have your career end. You might have had a completely consensual relationship, but it's just weird, because maybe you have this fetish or this kink or who God knows what. And that's the end of it, because just the fact of you being sexual in a way that's uh, even a slight bit noticeable is not okay. And this needs to be addressed. It's been tried before, but it's a medium, I would say, not a low hanging fruit, a medium hanging fruit. And then perhaps the most, the deepest of them all, the most difficult of them all, is fully piercing through the idea that leaders, by definition or by their own nature, are free from shadow, like, which kind of encompasses it all. Like, we would love to know, and it's the same with parents, we would love to know that our parents, up to a certain age, are somehow made of a different, you know, stamp than everyone. Like, literally, it's absurd, but we want to believe that so badly. Like, that my mom and my dad, they're different. They're not. They're humans, and it's kind of an obvious psychological truth. But when this happens in leadership, it's trickier to pin down, because it takes us, the ones that are being led in that context, to the edge of horror, to the edge of despair, to the edge of the ancestral feeling of, like, there's no adult in the room, which means we're all adults in the room. We're all doing this together. There's nobody that's more adult that can lead me, out of my predicament. And that's incredibly scary. So I don't think that that can be addressed, like from the get-go necessarily, but starting with vulnerability, starting with, I forgot to say that, starting with embodiment. Look, even a leader that during a powerful speech stretches that's already gonna be, oh wow, wait a minute. This person has a body. This person may have some ache. That's already big, So if you take it like this, and in our spaces, I think some of this practice, some of the things would be totally within reach. Embodiment, vulnerability, and then maybe in a generation, maybe in some time, addressing the hot piece of sexuality and the shadow, which is there. Leaders are humans in that way. So it's not no simple task, but the path is clear. The path is very clear.
Man, again, there's so much there, Rafa, right? Because and these are things which I've thought about a lot. One example for me is that I have such a passion for the stewardship of singularity as an example of a project that can offer something different in terms of political change in the world. And I'm also a vulnerable human who, there are circumstances where I feel super comfortable talking a bunch in front of a bunch of people, and there's some contexts where I feel nervous, and I've thought to myself before, if I ever was in one of these situations where I'm talking to people who are more used to conventional political leadership circumstances of, this like, this is how this works. And, who would be shocked by the idea of someone, starting to stretch out whilst they're giving such a speech. Wait, I just want to make sure. Can you still see me? Yeah, you can still see me. That's why the light got noisy. What about if I was to say, wow, I'm feeling a little shaky right now? Because I notice that I've got like 250 people in front of me, and actually my body senses that maybe there's some hostility here. Maybe there's some, whether that's true or not, actually for my animal body right now, this is feeling edgy, and I need to take a moment to breathe, before I'm able to share what I do think is of value in this space, or, how's that going to go down, right? This type of thing. And so there's that, just and when I take a moment to be with that, you know, I'm curious about your perspective as well. Just if we start with the low-lying fruit, which is vulnerability in terms of the stages that you spoke to or the levels that you spoke to, probably I imagine you have the same perspective that practicing vulnerability in an open way, I mean, it's a really good thing because it's human and it's life-giving, because when we're really honest and connected to what's real, then there's more life there. And there are circumstances where I think it's going to be safer to express open vulnerability in spaces where it's going to be less safe, where there are going to be people. I know, for instance, that there's a lot of men who would feel really hostile or threatened by the idea of a male leader who's openly expressing vulnerability in what they share. Like, why? Why is that? And I think there's something that I track around the fragility of the masculine ego sometimes, right? That has such a strong need for masculinity to look a certain way, the kind of more strong man, he's got his stuff together, he's not vulnerable, he's not weak type of thing. Why? Well, because actually I need an example of that to feel secure and safe in my sense of masculinity. There's something very fragile underneath very often these needs for the masculine to look big and strong and, kind of exemplifying all of these unfailing demonstrations of strength. Because actually what it often covers over is a place that's like, I don't know. I like, actually, this world's a big, scary place to be. I don't quite know where my place is, but I'm sure I have to be big and strong to survive and to find my place and have a sense of belonging. So there's stuff about that in relation to just vulnerability, and then in relation to sexual shadow. I'm curious about your perspective as well, because I think it's one thing for leaders to be acknowledged as sexual beings who are going to be sexually active because human beings are sexual beings. And the other side of that is the collective terror around people in power being openly permissioned as recognized sexual beings because of the history of the exploitation of power in all sorts of contexts where sexual shadow has been expressed 99.9% of the time by men, and that speaks to basically the kind of not just the pervasive omnipresence of sexual shadow in human beings, but it also speaks to the immaturity, the erotic immaturity that it is just the and the emotional erotic embodied immaturity, which has been the kind of and still is the state of things, and when I think about that, I think, well, okay, I guess I want leaders to be permissioned to be sexual beings, but I also want leaders who've been supported in the process of their growth to mature in terms of their capacity to be present and connected and anchored in 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 themselves and in their truth in a mature way in relation to their erotic energy, and when I think about that, I think, well, okay, well, that feels like it would be one critical piece of a process of leadership development, a new kind of approach to leadership development that involves these embodied dimensions and emotional dimensions and so on that we need to move towards. That I, in singularity, feels critical. That this is part of the kind of leadership development that we stand for. So I'm just curious about any of these pieces, how they come up for you.
Yeah, totally feeling you there. What comes to my mind is that like probably every cultural shift that we can envision on some level feels like a chicken and an egg problem. It's like how can you as a leader somehow transmit new codes if if the very fact of transmitting those new codes might completely jeopardize your eligibility as a leader. Like, the vulnerable example is a good one. Like, oh yeah, I can in principle agree with vulnerability as being a quality, but then when I am in front of the UN assembly and being vulnerable, like that's going to potentially end my career as a leader. And that's legitimate. All I know, and I have a lot of uncertainty about these things, is that sometimes it seems to be that for one reason or another, collective consciousness makes the leap, and all of a sudden something that was unthinkable before is now relatively okay. I'm sure that today in 2026, if the president of the United whatever nation, Security Council, whatever, pick your example, went and said, "Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you here. I'm just coming from my yoga class, and it's wonderful to be speaking to you all." I think that would be okay.
I think that'd be okay. Yeah.
60 years ago, that wouldn't be okay.
No, no, that
That
would
would not be okay.
cross some lines. Yeah.
Yeah, like, between World War One and World War Two, like, that would be like, who is this person? Like, just
With
get
this
them out of here
complete
now.
weirdo who has crossed major religious lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, like somehow like collective consciousness does then encompass new codes, but it takes a lot of bravery to be the first one when there is no model for that, to go and say, yes, well, yes, I do yoga. Similarly, like today with at least some angles about being gay are pretty metabolized, by the political system. It's not such a huge thing in some countries. If a politician goes out and said, "Yeah, I'm gay," okay, well, you know what? It's kind of metabolized. But 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been that easy. And maybe we're now with vulnerability at the threshold of something like that. That's my hope anyway. That's my prayer. Um, with sexuality, I totally hear you. Like, and you could make the same case for vulnerability. Like, whenever you allow a leader to be more human in the vulnerability sense, for instance, there is always a counterpart to that, which is, are they going to abuse their position to riff off that part of humanity that has been now handed back to them? You could imagine, it's maybe not as powerful an image, but you could imagine the same with vulnerability. You could have a leader that abuses their position of power to use their whole, cohort of people that they lead as their emotional punching bag, or, dumping ground or dumping place. And parents are liable of doing that in some cases.
Yep.
So you need to be, aware with that. Like, yes, you get to be human, and by the virtue of being a yes to holding power, you are playing in a different category and with different standards. So one thing doesn't imply that now you get to just have exactly the same margin of maneuver as someone that doesn't hold any positional or role power.
Mm,
The two things doesn't, one thing doesn't equate the other. It is also my thought, and of course, it's a more of a psychological truth than necessarily a proven truth in leadership, that when you allow people to be, at least in principle, more whole and more human, at least to speak about the fact that they have a sexuality, not to hide it, then, it's not that there's not going to be any shadow anymore, but in a way, you're already taking off steam from the main shadow engine in all of us,
yeah.
which is repression and suppression. So it doesn't mean that, there is no shadow anymore, but it means that the breathing room of the psyche has been enlarged and shadow thrives in the underground. So I have experienced that in some smaller communities, not in communities of millions of people, where yes, I felt that eventually I could trust my leaders more because they were more human.
Mm,
Even to the point that I made some kind of vow to myself. I don't know if it's, active anymore, that I wouldn't necessarily trust a leader in the future that I hadn't seen at least cry, once.
mm, mm,
Maybe it's too hard of a rule, but you get the point. It's like at the end of the day, the leaders that I did saw crying, I hold them in way more trust than I hold anyone in the political sphere today. So it's possible to make these shifts, but I feel you there because as a leader in your own organization, it takes a lot of courage. And it may backfire and it may not go well. And it may be that you end up being the one that, spoke about doing leadership in a different way and that was eaten away by the current level of collective consciousness. So it's tough.
yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation. I'm curious from your experience that you just spoke to around where you've felt that you've developed more trust in certain leaders that you've been surrounded by because of the levels of wholeness that they've been willing to reveal. I guess one side of that is the willingness on the part of those leaders to reveal themselves, to be seen when they cry, to be seen in themselves being erotic human beings, and to be seen in their shadows, to be seen in needing to stretch sometimes, like whatever the versions of that are. Um, but I feel like there's probably also community protocols or protocols of culture in a certain way in those contexts that can be intentionally created and maintained that provide spaces to for just maximum erotic and emotional hygiene in a certain way, right? For like that there's certain I'm curious if this is part of your experience, if it really was just the kind of like courageous choice of those leaders to be like, I'm going to let myself be seen, or whether there were certain ways that the culture had learned to operate that created spaces intentionally at whatever kind of regular intervals to be like, let's make sure that we're having an ongoing awareness about the fact that we're in a space that there is a certain power differential here, and it's important for us to have conversations about shadow, important, about erotic energy, or, whatever. And are there things that a political project like Singularity could do, or some kind of other ecosystem, other kind of organization that wants to try and do this differently, that involve a responsibility on the side of the leadership, but also protocols that can be engaged by the culture to just take care of us all as best possible?
I think it's a classic case, John, of a feedback loop, of an almost perfect feedback loop here, because leaders create culture and culture creates leaders.
Right,
Like it goes both ways.
right,
Like I can say about my own experience, coming into some communities like ISTA, for example, as a new person, um, seeing leaders, being vulnerable enabled me years later as a leader to feel much more comfortable around being vulnerable. So in that sense, the leaders created the culture.
yeah,
But it is also true, as you were pointing to, that they weren't operating in a vacuum. They were operating in a milieu that was at least not horrified by seeing a leader cry.
Yeah.
And how did that came to be? Based on a shared um, sort of like level of tools, vocabulary, practices that would make space, as you were suggesting, for instance, vulnerability.
Mm,
So I think that's a really good place to start. Like,
mm,
not everything needs to be a complete overhaul of, our collective consciousness. It is possible, and the flip side of that is, I think, in a community like Singularity or other communities, everything you do matters.
mm,
When you introduce a certain practice, let's say weekly calls where everybody, it's a circle and everybody is the role and they just get to share from their heart, and it doesn't matter so much what position you're in, you're creating culture. And when you create culture, eventually you will have a different margin of maneuver for what leaders can or cannot do in that culture. There's going to be benefits and risks, and for sure, I have experienced both, in the communities that I've been part of.
mm,
But if if the principle is sound, that's at least how I operate. If the principle is sound, if the principle of psychic wholeness is sound to me, then I'm going to continue trying to actualize it. The ways are shifting, the lessons are learned. Sometimes the actualization of a very sound principle, is not perfect, and it creates new problems that we didn't have before. So it can be quite frustrating as well.
mm,
But if the principle is sound, then implementing it becomes a matter of choice, but as in choice of what implementation to use, still based on that principle. And what I also find, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience, is that in a way the principle is like the note that you sound, in your collective, in your organization. And certain humans will get attracted to it. It's not likely that everybody in the world will resonate, at first sight, especially. So some people will be attracted, which is good,
mm.
because then it will become easier to experiment within that direction with people that aren't completely extraneous to what's being tried. So, personal case, when I remembered that moment of seeing my leaders cry, which was beautiful, or stretch, I also was already responding to a certain resonance of an organization that was, at least, to make an example, speaking about embodiment. Embodiment wasn't a mystery or wasn't a secret. So when we sound that note, I believe we have a possibility to then experiment with implementing these principles. Will a principle like this survive to being exposed to like big numbers, quote unquote, the mainstream? I don't know. I have doubts, or let's say possibilities around it. I think, strangely enough, Donald Trump shows us pretty clearly that whatever the masses in humanity may say about leadership, they still have hunger for instinctuality. They still have hunger for unfiltered action that's not processed endlessly by our frontal lobes. Even though our frontal lobes will rebel and say, oh, that's uncultured and vulgar. Yes, but still, So in a strange way, which I didn't expect, I would say that it's a good sign for the embodiment piece in humanity, that we still from time to time, albeit in a distorted and exaggerated form, choose leaders that are not some Apollonian disembodied mental form of a human being.
Yeah.
How to reconduct that to a way that is also heartfelt, that is also empathetic, that is also kind, is a very, very big question that I have in the current situation. But if I have to take something out of it and say this is good, is that, yeah, clearly, humanity as a whole needs more than just good guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's plain as daylight.
Yeah, and that touches on a thing which I've really felt into in the past as well, which is one thing that Trump is an exemplar to me of is that we long for authenticity. We long for, especially in our leaders, we long to feel the authenticity that this person is sharing themselves in a way that's really true to what's going on in them. and we're willing to accept versions of authenticity if that is the right way to, there's questions on whether that could really be described as authentic. But that other kind of authenticity is something which I've contemplated a lot. The one that you just spoke to is like, well, okay, what's the version of that authenticity that, as you said, comes is deeply honest about the realities of who they are as a human being in terms of their shadows and they're an erotic being, just like everyone, every human being is an erotic being, and they are owning the personal growth journey that they've been on. They're owning the places, their traumas, the things which they've been able to change within themselves and heal and grow, in the places that they haven't, and the work that they're doing, the vulnerability of that, and there's a they're rested in their heart as well, and there's a basic human kindness which lives in them, and they're not repressing or denying the parts that, the whole, how do we have versions of that that actually call us to our deepest in a way that includes all the layers of the human being, rather than just being a permission slip to the most, kind of materially pragmatic and essentially selfish aspects of us, right? And so, without denying those parts, that's a huge thing. There's one other area I'd like to go. It's a different area with you before we close today, Rafa, which is to do with misogyny, and it's to do with a current of misogyny that I think is actually really prevalent in collective culture today, and is having this strange but simultaneously very likely significant explosion of permissioning in a certain way, in certain contexts. I think examples of Donald Trump's behavior in a lot of ways, where there's just just some of the stuff that he regularly says and does is just like, oh my God, it is so revealing of an attitude and perception towards women, which is shocking in a lot of ways, right? But then there's people like Andrew Tate, and there's the whole incels thing, which is something that I've thought about a lot. This kind of movement of more and more young men who feel really angry at women, and who feel deeply isolated in their longings for intimacy, though I'm not sure they would put it that way, but who feel essentially like they've got a really shit deal, basically, in terms of how they experience being in a male body in this time, and who they want to point their finger at kind of being the perpetrating forces or whatever that's landed them there. And Andrew Tate, for instance, for me, he's kind of like king. He's king of that world, or he's one of the kings of that world that is taking even a very public stand for a misogynistic worldview that is a channeling of this rage, and that is present there. And as I tune into that domain, I feel so much pain, right? It feels like there's so much pain. There's so much of a longing for intimacy, so much of a lack of understanding about how to actually cultivate intimacy. So much of a feels like there's just like a massive demographics problem as well, just in terms of like the number of humans who are really struggling to find spaces where they actually can experience any kind of connection and intimacy, and the parts in them that just turn in on themselves when that's the case. And I'm curious about your perspective as someone who's done a lot of work and who is a leader in the domain of embodied transformation, conscious sexuality, and so on. As you sense this thing which is going on in collective culture, I'm curious any perspectives that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about these things a lot, and my perspective isn't always so easy to explain because it can ruffle many feathers. But let's put it this way. I firmly believe that the problem of erotic and sentimental satisfaction, for humans in a society, in a community, cannot be solved purely individually by just leaving everybody to fend for themselves. Like go out and find a partner, go out and find a lover. Like, oh, you want sex? Just go out and find sex. You want love? Just go out like we can say this, but it doesn't work.
Mm.
There are all layers of problematics in being sexually and emotionally in a romantic or, let's say, a partnership sense that cannot be addressed by the individual alone. Some people can in some times of their life, some people can't for a variety of reasons, having to do with class, finance, but also just the more real fact of erotic currency. Like, just the same as everyone has a different size of a bank account, everybody also has a different deposit repository of erotic capital, and that shifts in life. And it's not always fair. All of this to say, I cannot envision a society that is supportive if it doesn't try to address this issue as well as in a communitarian way. And our current societies don't do that. First of all, there is this really damaging double standard, and on one level, rightfully so, tries to educate everybody around consent and around, always priming the consent aspect of relationships, which is great, but then in the same breath marginalizes, and not only that, but even punishes any kind, for example, of conscious sex or intimacy work, being provided by people. And granted, it's a complex problem, but you can't possibly imagine a healthy society where there is no possibility to get your sexual or romantic needs met unless you have a partner. Like, that's never gonna work. It's just even a mathematical problem, You can't possibly pair everyone up and have everybody be happy, or triad, or foursome. So it's a deeply unjust situation for men and women alike, in different, for example, if we tune, for example, into the pain of aging women and what it means for a woman in current, I'm generalizing a lot, but to lose that erotic capital, first of all, to be given that erotic capital in many cases, not in all cases, just by virtue of youth and gender, and then to have that capital taken away from you without you having done anything, just by the pass of time. That's deeply painful. And it can create a lot of anger and resentment towards men, understandably. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have this, the incels, which I don't know, but I can imagine as being probably quite shy young men that are maybe into computers or into, video games, and that doesn't grant you any social and sexual capital. And then what does society tell them? Just that go out and find a girl according to these rules that we're giving you, and if you can't, well, tough luck. Well, that's deeply wrong, because the need for sexuality, intimacy, companionship is so powerful. You can't just leave it to chance and hazard this way. So what should society do? I don't know. Get creative, organize blind date nights. I don't know, do something like the conscious sexuality or embodied awareness camp has tried to address this by, for example, creating, temple nights with, there's rules and regulations, but you're not going to be left out because you don't have the right outfit. You're not going to be left out because you like video games, or don't like video games, or whatever the case may be. So, see, what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, of course, misogynistic incels are a symptom, and we can treat the symptom or we can try to address the cause, but addressing the cause is scary, because addressing the cause means recognizing that, if you let me riff freely, that the right to a fulfilling sexual and emotional life is a basic human right, and societies should do their best and utmost to provide it. In the same way that they do the best and utmost, they should do their best and utmost to prevent sexual exploitation, sexual violence. It's just two sides of the same coin. But if you go out now, as a leader and say, I think, all of my citizens should have access to, companionship, and if they cannot find it, well, we will provide it. Only very few countries can speak about that openly. And in my opinion, on that level, they're the most advanced countries in the world, because they address this piece, at least with an open heart and awareness, and not pushing it down the carpet, under the carpet.
Wow, that's very powerful. Yeah, I really feel that. And it has me contemplate the epidemic of loneliness that is such a thing, such a thing. And I actually even was doing some research around that a little while ago, because we have in Singularity, we have a one of our assemblies of the One Earth that we call them, that's happening later this year, which is focused on love and our cultures around love, and the paradigms around love that we have, and so on. But I found myself just really drawn into reading about this idea that there is a kind of epidemic of loneliness that is part of our current social reality. And there's a bunch of sociologists that are kind of writing about this, and the causes and realities and data, and so on. And yeah, it feels like an intractable problem when related to at the level of the individual, right? Just as you're saying, it doesn't even, I mean, of course, people have a level of responsibility to be the architects of their own life and so on. But yeah, there are the realities that you're speaking to. I find the idea of like erotic capital like a really fascinating notion as well, because erotic capital, the way that you're speaking about it, is not inherent, right? It's a projected reality that's assigned according to the values that are current, essentially. So a person's erotic capital is in a sense, I mean, actually, probably there's a dimension of it which is inherent and which has kind of natural dimensions that are probably quite mysterious to us to really be able to kind of speak to. But there's a huge amount of it which is projected and which is kind of collectively decided based on the current trends, of like what a beautiful male bodied being or female bodied being or some other designation is. And so to be assigned that in a way that basically brings privilege that no one's asked for that. No one's said, yes, please sign me up for that, although a lot of people would like it, and then to have it taken away based on factors that are utterly beyond our control, such as aging, yeah, it just shows the kind of like the dangerous game that we're all playing in a certain way, or like the dangerous ecosystem that we're all in, where these things come and go based on things that don't really feel deeply related to the truth of me or deeply related to the truth of you on the inside, and so I find that really powerful to be with, and the idea that there is a necessity for, I mean, wow, that's a completely different notion of the responsibility of the state, right? That's a radical notion of the responsibility of the state to be active in facilitating and supporting the relational and even erotic well-being, right, of citizens. That's wild
It's
compared
so
to
wild, and at the same time, it's so obviously right, at least as far as I'm concerned. As
right.
far as I know, also, in different societies in the past, and to some extent in the present, that wasn't at all a strange idea. There's all kinds of shamanic tribal societies where this was taken care of in one way or another, and as well as other eras of the Western society where at least there were different approaches. But I hear you. In current terms, it's like, what? Isn't that the ultimate private thing everybody should take care of by themselves? Well, no. Why would that be? Given the fact that it affects the community, given the fact that, as you were saying, erotic capital, while it may be grounded on some inner, skills, talents, whatever features, it's an intersubjective reality. It gets assigned by the interaction between people in a similar way that wealth does, that like financial wealth does. So since we have structures like, I don't think any of us would really argue for the fact that the best state in the world is the one that leaves everybody completely individualized in their quest for financial, stability. There's for sure like shades of that, more this or more that, but some level of community support seems reasonable, versus just everybody fend for themselves. Similar in the erotic realm. I mean, for me, it's very clear. Now, how to implement it and how to harmonize that with the ideas and difficulties we have around sexuality, it's much easier said than done. There's no doubt. I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is an easy, problem to address. But I agree with you. If you make it an individual issue only, you get absolutely nowhere. It's by definition a community piece.
I'm just remembering, you I'm sure know this book, Sex at Dawn, right? And this book that's essentially an exploration of the patterns of human relationship extending over hundreds of thousands of years, and really examining the idea that our current idea of kind of monogamous relationships is a very recent invention comparatively. But they do a lot of exploration of patterns of relationship that exist within non-human species, and bonobos. There's the whole discussion of bonobos and the way that bonobos have these kinds of collective sexual kind of explosions in a certain way that happen, or these collective congregating kind of sexual experiences that are said to be deeply regulating essentially for the whole community. And I'm then thinking about the kind of ancient Dionysian rites and so on that seem to happen. There were these ecstatic, orgiastic things that went on. But the thing I actually want to go to, which feels, I'm curious about this because it feels like right now, with the rise of AI, we are on a precipice around exactly this question to do with human loneliness, where I had this recognition probably a bunch after a lot of people got it, but it was a while ago where I just had this moment of like, oh my God, wait a minute, like robots, right? There's about to be, this is, whatever, 10 years from now, maybe even less, probably there's going to be an insanely vast industry as to provide human beings with AI infused robotic beings as an answer to all of our deepest intimacy longings and sexual longings and so on. And it's obviously a profoundly wild reality to be considering. And just as I'm even speaking into it, I feel the tear within myself between the parts of me where that feels so fundamentally wrong, the idea that that would be our answer, or our attempted answer to this question. And I also have another part of me which I was saying to friends, where I've had conversations with ChatGPT over recent times where I've felt profoundly seen, and I felt so deeply understood, and kind of incredible feedback and connection, and it's an algorithmic, statistical, kind of machine. So yeah, just I feel like we are on a precipice in so many ways today around the emergence of these technologies, which are already fundamentally, radically reshaping human life. And it's inevitable that this is going to overflow into this already existing chasm, basically, in the collective human emotional body, and the level of sensed disconnection from intimacy and sexual health, in terms of a relational way. And I'm curious if this is something that you've contemplated.
I mean, for sure, just that the problem is that there's no time for contemplating it because it's happening so fast. And I find myself reflecting on it and then just getting the latest aha moment, of which I've had like many, around exactly how the emergence of a new category, of a new class of intelligence, because I think we need to start recognizing it as such, is yeah, absolutely affecting our emotional state, our nervous state, our relationships. And to be honest to you, sometimes I find that I don't have words because my words are too slow to keep pace with just the singularity that we are approaching. I feel similarly both at times deeply concerned
Mm.
by these developments, and at times optimistic and excited. And I've had as well moments where I felt deeply seen by my conversation with an AI agent. And I am struggling, to be honest to you, to find a framework of understanding that is applicable to this because I've never been in such a situation before. And as I said, like the time that it takes my sense-making abilities is orders of magnitude slower than the time that, than the gap between a new um, threshold of our relationship with agents. So in a strange way, I am choosing to just be in it, and see what happens. But I believe it's a really new feature of our times, specifically of this innovation, that the magnitude of the changes is so big, but the time to reflect on them and digest them is nearly disappearing, at least in human time, in carbon brain based time. So I believe, or I feel that what we're going through with AI and what you were describing is the ultimate example of a process that can't fully be looked at from the outside. It's too sort of like too happening, it's too immanent, we're too much in it to be able to reflect. And that brings with it, in a way, I would say some level of exhilaration. you know it's real, it's happening, it's the future is here. The future does has collapsed into the present. There is no future that we can imagine anymore because it's here. uh, but at the same time, it also brings a terror, because what do we become as a species if we cannot by design have the time to reflect and choose, because the processes that we set in motion are too quick for our slow brain, to even attempt at making sense of them. So I don't know. It's for some reason the metaphor that's coming to me, which is kind of encouraging, is although I've never been in a birth of a human, and I imagine maybe you have, that's maybe another time where you can't reflect on what's happening. It's just happening. You don't have the time because life is moving faster. And strangely enough, I feel that that's what's happening with AI right now. It's too fast to be reflected on.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And intuitively, instinctively, there's something in me that feels like if we outsource this piece to technology, something's been missed. In terms of, I found myself just quite touched by your perspective on like the collective responsibility as far as intimacy and sexuality are concerned, and that doesn't obviate individual responsibility for how I show up or how another individual shows up in relation to intimacy and sexual connection with others. But the idea that this is something that we humans take care of with each other because that's loving and that's right and that is healthy, that feels better to me than we don't know how to deal with this, so here's a robot, you know, and it's programmed to be able to meet your needs really well, so yeah.
Perhaps as kind of like a conclusion, like, or conclusion of these two streams of thought, it might be, this is an optimistic view and it might be naive, but it might be that with this incredible acceleration of what technology and technological intelligence can do for us, maybe that domain that we were just speaking about, the domain of relating, the domain of sexuality, is going to be where a lot of our human attention goes to. Because, yeah, robots that tend to those needs, it might be far away, actually. It might happen, but it might take 2 or 3 generations. Who knows? I don't know. But perhaps, when so many other fields of human inquiry are better taken care of by silicon-based intelligences, then maybe we will take a breath and go like, okay, well, now what really matters is meaning, purpose, intimacy, erotic satisfaction, and then we might be able to give some good answers to that.
Rafa, I had no idea that we would end up here,
That's good, good sign.
in terms of where the conversation would go. This has been awesome. Thank you so much. I feel like I personally have a bunch of just reflections for myself in terms of my own leadership and my own. I just feel like I've had a bunch of insights around things that are good for me to look at in terms of my own wholeness and for singularity as well. And I just this has been a real gift for to spend this time with you and go into these topics. Thank you for sharing this time with me.
Likewise, John, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Beautiful.